I started out here as a Protestant, as someone who was not Catholic, who had no real understanding of Advent, even though I realized later that there were aspects of Advent that had been incorporated into my life even since childhood. One of the things that I remember as a kid growing up in my very Protestant but very deeply religiously committed household was that we didn't get into any type of Christmas decorating or anything else until after Thanksgiving. That was a staple in our house because our parents wanted us to take the time to always acknowledge God in everything that we did. And I know a lot of people, right after Halloween, you'll start to walk into the stores, like if you ever walked into Walmart or you go into Michael's or Hobby Lobby, the day after Halloween, all of the stuff is coming down, all the Halloween stuff is coming down, all of the Christmas stuff is coming up. You're getting to hear all of the Christmas music already going in. My parents made it a point to say, nope, that is not that way. The rest of the world, because unfortunately they told me this one time, they said, Thanksgiving was very much like Rodney Dangerfield. It gets no respect. Okay, for those of y'all who are under 40, I understand that reference went completely over your head. Just bear with us. Ask other folks in the room. They'll tell you exactly what that means. But I didn't realize that what began as a tradition in our home of really just taking the time, first of all, to be thankful to God for what we had, that in Thanksgiving we were able to share, but when we begin to move into the Christmas season, we begin to do certain things that really were more Catholic in nature than I even understood them to be. Because we did go into the point of having an Advent calendar in our home. One of the traditions that I had that my father instituted when I was a kid was that every night we would gather together in front of the living room, and we would completely disconnect ourselves from everything except the time that we spent together. There would be no TV, there would be no type of electronic gadgetry or gears that we would get lost in. And we would sit and we would talk, and my father would sit and he would teach my sister and I the importance of what was coming and why it was important for us as Christians to understand and appreciate who God was. And that was something that I actually carried over into my own life as an adult with my children. That was something that my wife encouraged, because what we would do, and what was a perfect example that we enjoyed very much doing, was that we would set up the Advent calendar, and before they could touch the Advent calendar, before they could reach in, get anything, we would open the Bible, and the book of Luke was an excellent chapter because Luke is 24 chapters long. And from December 1st to December 24th, we read every night one chapter out of the Bible in the book of Luke. And we would wait until that night on the 25th, and we would go back over the story of Jesus' birth and entry into the world. That was a tradition that began with my father, and I thank him to this day for that, because that mattered so much. And you don't think about it as a kid, but when you begin to plant those traditions in the minds of your children and your grandchildren, it gets to a point where it's expected. When December 25th would always come around, my sister and I, even when we entered into adulthood, if we were over at our parents' house, no matter what we were doing, they'd say, what are we going to do the Christmas story? My mother and my father looked at us one time, and we're well past our 20s, going into our 30s. He was like, we thought you were too old for that. He said, no, we want to hear it. And our parents would go in, they would buy eggnog, they would pour up glasses for each and every one of us, and they would read to us that Christmas story every night on the 25th. So when I got to a point as an adult, still not Catholic, still Protestant, but with the blessing of a Catholic wife who understood, Advent began to take on a whole new meaning and an understanding for me, because I was being introduced slowly but surely into those traditions, because that was something that had been hers all of her life. All of her life, she had understood the basis of a Catholic upbringing and a Catholic understanding of Advent, its importance, its sacredness, And we begin to go through those moments with our children. And when I began to make that journey into studying the Catholic faith and myself later becoming Catholic, it became that much more real and that much more potent to me. And so we made it a point to actually decorate, really get into the spirit of things, the mood of things, and I kept those traditions that started with my father that came to me, and we always gathered around together, and we did that as a family. And I was thankful for that. For those of you who were here last Thursday, I was fortunate enough to give a brief synopsis of what went on in my journey in becoming Catholic. And one of the greatest influences was my wife. My wife was someone who had prayed over me in my journey to become Catholic. She never pushed it, she never pressed it, but she always trusted in my ability to learn and to lead my family. And when I came into the Catholic faith as a believer, I came of my own accord. And my wife was thankful for that. And she encouraged us as a family to get together in doing those things, especially in the season. And as I talk about this, Advent takes on a special meaning for me now, more so than ever as a Catholic, because around this time was around the time that my wife and I got married. My wife and I were married November 27th. So always around Advent season coincided with our anniversary. So there was always a little bit extra that came with Advent season because of that. And because of that, it always had a more pungent meaning that was more spiritual, that was more intimate, more personal. And as I was praying over what to say in Advent, and I was asking God to give me direction, I remembered sitting down and just watching and really reflecting on what Advent meant. And I was turned on to someone that I listen to very much. How many of you have ever heard of Father Mike Schmitz with Ascension Presents? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any of you, if you ever get an opportunity, YouTube plays excellent channels. He is a luminary who actually breaks down Catholic principles and ideas in a very simple way. And one of the things that he talked about in Advent, he said that Advent has two purposes. It is the welcoming in of Christmas. He said the first one is the welcoming in of Christmas. It is the welcoming in of receiving the Christmas season. But it is also, and he made something that was very pointed. He said, it is also the point of welcoming in Jesus. And he made a point that I had not really given as much of a thought or consideration. He said, what if you actually think of Advent as the time that you're going to die? And it struck me the depth of what that meant. He said that when we sit there and we consider the fact that when we are not only accepting the Christmas season, we are accepting Jesus to come to us. And that's going to be a reality for each and every last one of us throughout life. Because death hangs around each and every one of us with a probability of roughly 100%. And whether that's Jesus coming at the end of time to usher in his kingdom in the life of the world to come, or us on an individual level coming to meet Jesus himself, we have to consider, are we prepared to see Advent? Are we prepared to see it as us preparing to die? What if this was the last Advent that we got to do? What if this year was the last Advent that we ever had, and that was the day that we actually knew at the end of Advent, on Christmas Eve, we were going to get ready to meet God in the literal sense. We get into this attitude about Christmas and the Advent season where it's this big rush where we have to get stuff together. We got to get the right food, we got to get the cookies and the baking, we got to go to the stores and we have to shop. But if you actually have to put yourself in a situation where you have to think, what if this was the last Advent that you ever had? A lot of that stuff kind of falls into the background, doesn't it? When you realize that you don't have that to worry about because you have something more important. That idea was crystallized for me in Advent of 2017. Like I said, many of you have heard the story of my wife and her influence in my life as a Catholic. But what a lot of you do not realize is that 7 months after the greatest moment that ever occurred to me in my life, in becoming one in the Catholic faith, some of the darkest days that I ever knew would be right there over the horizon. Because in November of 2017, my wife and I found out that she had cancer. And we immediately began to go about the process of taking every chance and every remedy that we could to get her treatment and get her well. What I did not realize was that Christmas of 2017 was the last Advent that she would ever have. Because in May of that following year, May of 2018, the day before Mother's Day, my wife went home to be with God. And I had to live with the reality of that. And what had been a more joyous and spiritual occasion for me, because that was a time that we celebrated our time together, not only in the Advent Christmas season, but also as husband and wife, because our anniversary was attached to that, became painful for me. Because I had to live with the reality that somebody who had meant more to me than my own life could not share those times with me. And for the first few years, it was the hardest thing that I could ever do. I found myself in a state of depression because I could not live with the idea of going through and celebrating, knowing that the person who helped to make our house a home was not there physically for us. I had to go in with my children, who were 10 and 5 at the time. And we had to walk through this time not knowing what that was. And it was one of the most difficult things that I could ever place, and I had no way of knowing what to do. And God had to begin to minister to me about Advent and about its importance, because I had an obligation to my children that I could not ignore because I was grieving, because I was at a loss. Because one of the things that actually happens to us when we're grieving and we have to deal with the reality is we deal with the things that we have left behind or the things that we have failed to do. What made my grief so difficult was because I felt like I had lost out on so many things that I was not going to be able to do with that person. It's a strange thing when you realize that your happily ever after comes a lot shorter. It comes to an end a lot earlier than you would ever think it should. But that was my reality. And I had to understand, Lord, how do I move forward from this? And God began to minister to me in a very powerful way. Because one of the things that the Holy Spirit had to minister to me, he said that when it was my time, when it was my wife's time for her to meet God, she was prepared, and where she is right now, every day is an Advent season because she sees God and they walk one with each other, hand in hand, and they rejoice in one another. And I didn't understand, and there was something about that I couldn't grasp or contain. But I knew that on a certain level, I had to get to a point where, God, I need you to lead me. I need you to direct me. How do I do this now that this person isn't here, but I want to honor that? So what I do now is that I remember my wife, and especially on that day, one of the things that I do personally, and I lead with my children, is that we will sit and we will do a rosary for her during the Advent season. And on that day, that is our anniversary, I will say that prayer. And if I am not at home because I'm at work or wherever else I am, I will find a church and I will walk into that building. And for that hour, I will do that as a way to honor her memory, because I have a responsibility to honor what that stood for. I had a responsibility to honor what that meant to us. And I had a responsibility that I could not give up for myself or for my children, because I had to lead as an example of what's going on. And each and every last one of you are in the exact same situation. Whether you have children, whether you have grandchildren, or those of you who one day, while you don't have children, one day you may get to that point. It is your responsibility in an Advent season, which is one of the holiest times. You have to set the standard and the boundaries to teach your children about God, because what you fail to teach, the world will teach. And the world will teach a warped sense of what that is. So for me, I choose to teach my children. I choose to keep that alive. And I do that now more so than ever because not only do I honor the person who now celebrates Advent in heaven and prays on our behalf, but I also have reason and motivation to do so here on earth, because now, for the first time, I have more of a reason now to pass that on, not just to my children, but to children who have yet to come into my life, because God has blessed me with someone who is special, who has loved me in the midst of that grief, in the midst of that brokenness, and in her wisdom, she has seen fit to honor not only that season, but my wife's memory. And that person is here tonight. She is my fiance. My fiance is standing here as a living witness, and I have been blessed both with a wife who is in heaven and a wife-to-be who is here on earth, who have both been Catholic in their faith and who have said, this is what we will do to honor this holy season. And they have both agreed in their own ways to walk with me in that. And I am a man blessed beyond measure because of those moments. So as you consider this season, consider what it is that you do and consider what it is that you're willing to give up. Because I have to live with that knowledge every day, and I'm reminded of it. Are you prepared to die, not physically, but are you prepared to die to yourselves about what you think is important versus that which actually is important? Is the shopping truly that important? Is the hustle and the bustle of that Christmas season important? Or do we return to a simpler time where we honor God as is intended? So many people I see from my profession who get into arguments and fights trying to create an image and an illusion, and by the time Christmas is done, they're sick of each other. Because I go to calls during this season, and I've seen people who are supposed to be their holiest who are at their nastiest and their meanest. Whatever it is that you have on the table, I don't care if it's a disagreement, I don't care if it's a challenge about what you believe about being done for the season versus what this person believes, leave that on the table and be willing to die to self and return to your first love, return to this Advent season, return to a time where God is in the center, because I am a living witness to the fact that, you know what, you're not promised forever. I'm a living witness to the fact that Advent, the last Advent that I had spent with somebody, that is a very real thing. And for some of those who have gone through the exact same thing that I've gone through, this time is one of the roughest times of the year, because when you've lost someone and you've had to realize that, you know what, for them, Christ coming forward came sooner than what was expected. You realize how much really doesn't matter. So I ask that you take this into consideration. Take the time to think about what it is that you do. Think about what is truly important to you in this season. And think about who it's important with. Because at the end of the day, it's not going to be the presents that are going to matter. It's not going to be how tall the tree is, how nice the decorations are. It's not going to be how many cookies were baked. It's not going to be who's going to come over and who's going to compliment you on how well your lights look in your front yard or how beautifully decorated your home is. What's going to matter is, what did you teach your family? What did you bring to your family in this season? And if you're not prepared to do that, then you need to have a re-examination of self, a re-examination of conscience, of soul, of mind, and you need to return to that which matters most. That we are here with anticipation, expecting the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords to come into our lives and let him transform us for the better. Thank you folks so much for your time.
So you have some challenges. Let's see what they are.